Canada's progressive press is insisting that the story of Mark Carney's trans activist daughter is both off limits and unimportant at the same time. And I do think that this is worth addressing. In a previous episode of The Briefing, I explained what the political implications of that story were, why the story is actually politically relevant, because of course, the gender ideology is being debated right now, right across the country. And now we have a prime minister whose views are at bare minimum going to be informed by his daughter's views, or as Barbara Kay put it on X, even if Mark Carney disagrees with her in his heart of hearts, he's not going to take any opposing position just to keep family peace, which is, again, totally understandable. But to claim that the story has no political implications at all is frankly just wrong. And one of the reasons so many journalists are claiming this is because they don't think gender ideology is a big deal. So they don't think that kids transitioning is a big deal. They don't think the idea of a third gender on Canadian documents is a big deal. And so if you don't think gender ideology is a big deal, then you can write off the story of the Prime Minister's trans activist daughter as no big deal. But that's premised on whether or not you think this is a really important issue, which millions of Canadians do, and obviously the Premier of Alberta does as well. But I want to defend why I think this story was worthy of coverage, in particular from even more than just the political side of things. And so one of the things I asked Robin Urbach of the Globe and Mail online was if Pierre Poilievre had an adult child. So keep in mind, Sasha Carney is 24 years old. And there's all of these journalists and these liberal commentators on X and elsewhere saying you can't bully a child. She is 24 years old. Younger than when Justin Trudeau was wearing blackface, but still 24 years old, pretty up there. She graduated from Yale University, and she is also a writer. Now, what do writers do? It might help for the journalists making this claim to reflect on what it is that writers do. They communicate things to the public for the purposes of public consumption because they want people to read the words that they write. And so the reason we know Sasha Carney did therapy at Tavistock Clinic in London, not as some ex-commentators are falsely claiming, she did not undergo transition, or if she did, there's no evidence for that. But the reason we know she went to Tavistock Clinic is because she wrote this in an essay for a magazine that she wanted people to read. So the idea that commenting on what she has publicly written, the idea that that's off limits is very strange. It's very bizarre. Because when I'm writing about gender ideology or politics or any of the issues that I write about very regularly, you're trying to add your voice to a public conversation about those issues, and you fully expect people to interact with you on the subject that you're writing about. And Sasha Carney bills herself as a writer. She is described in bios for many different publications as a writer based in Brooklyn. She's also an editor. Just to read one of the descriptions that's online, I spent a while kind of going through some of her other public writing. She's described as a writer and editorial assistant from Ottawa, based in Brooklyn, a two-time recipient of the Foyle Young Poets of the Year Award, had poetry longlisted for the CBC Poetry Prize in 2019, and has published fiction, nonfiction, and poetry in the Yale Literary Magazine, The Forge, Barron Magazine, and others. I spent a few hours this week kind of reading through a lot of her published work. And Carney, again, isn't just some kid who struggled with gender dysphoria. She is an adult who bills herself as a trans activist. So, for example, in a story covered by the Yale Daily News, she was actually at a trans vigil, and she was complaining about the fact that there were very few sort of straight cisgender people present. There was just LGBT identifying people. And here's what she said, quote, "I think now more than ever, when transgender rights are being tangibly threatened by the Trump administration, when people's access to healthcare, hormone therapy, name changes, and legal gender recognition, all of these are political hot-button issues, face a threat of all being swept away, it is more important than ever to force people to realize that this is something which impacts the communities all around them." This was a public speech covered by the Yale Daily News, to which she gave quotes so that people could read her opinion on issues of current political importance. This is really important stuff. The idea that we can't interact with her public writing when she's inserting her voice into the conversation surrounding gender ideology, but that we're not allowed to read that, somehow off limits to engage with her public work, is genuinely stupid. It really is. And back to my previous point, like, if Pierre Poilievre had a 24-year-old kid, a 24-year-old son or daughter, who was a pro-life activist, for example, do you think the journalists would leave it alone? Do you think say that's off limits? Or would they say he is an adult, he is an advocate for a position that's debated here in Canada, and his position sheds light on his father's position? Would that not be news? Of course it would be news. Or let's say Pierre Poilievre's kid was Billboard Chris, or an anti-gender ideology activist who was doing exactly what Sasha Carney is doing, but from the opposite perspective. If Pierre Poilievre had a journalist kid living in New York, constantly talking about the dangers of gender ideology, would that be considered a story? There is no doubt that would be considered a major story. And so when Robin Urbach of the Globe and Mail says this is a trash story with zero public interest, she's actually describing her own opinion of the gender ideology debate in general, more than anything else. She says it's a terribly weak way to defend publishing a story that cruelly targets a politician's kid just to whip up fury. Well, there are people cruelly targeting all kinds of people on X. But that's not what the Juno News story did. And Candace Malcolm's analysis of the story was very sympathetic. So yes, she's publishing the information that Sasha Carney published first, I might point out. It's the only reason we know about it. But again, she's not like, going over and giving a noogie to a 5-year-old or publishing private, intimate details of, a 12-year-old's hospital records or something. They're engaging with the written public record as published publicly by somebody who is an aspiring writer, which means they want people to read their stuff. So or are we supposed to read it and we're not allowed to express our opinion on it because she's the daughter of the prime minister of the country? All right. That does speak to what their journalistic standard is, but pretty weird. It is pretty weird. Again, if the roles were reversed, I think that it would be completely different. Let me give you another example of why I think Carney's work is actually interesting. So I went through a couple of even her major essays, and she wrote an essay back in 2022 called Formed This Way for another publication based, again, at Yale University, one of the top Ivy League schools. And she details her views on transgenderism in very stark terms and basically makes the case for gender fluidity. So she says this: the belief in an innate gender is an understandable defense against a homophobic and transphobic world. I thought it was science, but fair. Lady Gaga sang Born This Way to a pre-Obergefell v. Hodges America. After all, queers are prickly in the face of conversion therapy logic, which is correctly perceived as the attempts of dominant society to nudge aberrant desires towards more palatable ones. If we as trans people did not choose our strangeness, if it is instead a naturalized cradle-to-grave form of human difference, then it follows that it can be tolerated in the name of equality, maybe even in extraordinary circumstances embraced. So she then attacks the idea that trans-identifying children are somehow being victimized and dismisses Abigail Schreier's landmark book, Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters, as basically fear-mongering, although she writes that, quote, it is an anti-trans text that I never have read and never will. And quite frankly, her essay really does reveal that she hasn't read it, because she's engaging with what she wants Abigail Schreier to have written, not what Abigail Schreier actually wrote. But then Sasha Carney writes this, again, public essay, all you gotta do is plug her name into Google and it pops up. Gender is inherently a process of social relation. Who you are as a woman or a man or otherwise forms in relation to the gendering of those around you. A cisgender man in a locker room may feel socially compelled towards certain motions, phrases, or stories. She's obviously never been in a male locker room. We just change and get out of there. And to affirm and solidify their own manhood in the world. No, we're just basically trying to get our pants on and leave. What is so natural about that? Ask yourself now, do your friends perform or do gender? Your mother, your father, your partner? Is the performance of cisgender heterosexual manhood, for instance, any less determined by who you are friends with, the insecurities you have around your body, or your desire to amass social capital? Brazilian waxes and pre-workout smoothies alike are gender-affirming processes. Shaving your face and wearing a dress can be too. So this is all very Judith Butler-esque queer studies gobbledygook, and a lot of it's actually internally contradictory, because if we merely do gender, then why do we need surgeries and hormone therapy to make sure that the feelings you have on the inside, which, as she points out, are ever evolving, match the body you have on the outside. I think that the description she just gave of gender fluidity here directly contradicts the need for the very treatments that she's defending elsewhere in her work. And indeed, many of the arguments that I think Schreier lays out really chillingly, they kind of are enhanced by Carney's central argument. And in all likelihood, because Carney hasn't actually read Schreier's book, there's no engagement with the key premises of those who are warning about the long-term harms of gender-affirming care, such as the fact that somebody going on puberty blockers and then getting top and bottom surgery will essentially be rendered infertile and unable to experience sexual intimacy before they are old enough to vote, drink, or drive. That is the question at hand here, not dealt with at all. Now, I want to emphasize it's entirely possible that Prime Minister Mark Carney doesn't share some or even all of these views. But to claim that the public writing and activism of Sasha Carney has no bearing on how her father, the Prime Minister of Canada, will approach these issues, even if, as Barbara Kay observed, he's merely doing so for the sake of his daughter, is totally implausible. As Barbara Kay wrote, we can forget about Mark Carney engaging with the subject in any substantive way, whatever his innermost beliefs are. He will toe the party line in the interest of family peace. And she's completely right about that, unfortunately. Thank you all for listening. Once again, drop any comments or suggestions in the comment section. Join the conversation that way. Like the video if you enjoyed it. Share it around if you thought the content was useful. That obviously helps us get the news about the show out. And you can listen to our content or download it wherever you get your content.